All right, folks. Try to work my way through a couple more questions that I've been asked. Hmm. Smoking my Big Ben Wade. Big Ben, I think I'll call it. I don't typically name pipes, but a couple of them seem to have named themselves here recently. In my Big Ben, I've got something. What is it? Ulcho Krantz. If you guys have questions for me, you like this series of question and answer stuff, ask me more questions. The more, the better. I would like to have so many questions that I have to pick and choose which ones I even answer. But I like to get to them all anyway. So this series, or this episode, if you want to call it that, let's see here, features Francis Barnett and Todd Blessing. Francis Barnett noted that Loudon Wainwright III has kind of documented his life in song, and he did it in such a way when he was younger. He sang about that time period, and as he got older, he started singing about older things, and it's kind of a chronicle of his life. His music is, and it's really interesting. I think he's a rather overlooked songwriter because he's written some fantastic stuff, and you don't hear a lot about him. He's a songwriter's songwriter. The people like John Prine and Guy Clark and all those guys were his contemporaries. They looked up to him, and he looked up to them. But anyway, Francis wants to know if there's anybody else that I can think of that did that as effectively or as in the same way that he did. And I can't really think of anybody. Two things came to mind. One of them was Guy Clark. He wrote a bunch of personal songs, and early in his career, they were kind of freewheeling, life on the road and that kind of stuff. And as he got older, his music matured. It got very different. It was still Guy Clark to its core, but the content of it was very different, much deeper, I think. Like Boats to Build, that was a good album. A lot of stuff in there about settling down and being a married man and not being so wild and crazy. And he was very wild and crazy in his younger days. He ran around with Townes Van Zandt, and it was interesting. But on his last album, it was called My Favorite Picture of You, or My Favorite Photo of You, or something like that. And it was, when that album came out and I heard it, I knew it would be the last thing he ever did. It was after his wife Suzanne had died, and there was a tremendous change in his voice and what he was singing about and stuff like that. You could tell he was nearing the end of his days, and he was. He ended up dying not too terribly long after that, but he sounded tired on that album, not musically, but physically. He sounded like an old man as opposed to some of his younger stuff. like LA Freeway and that kind of stuff. But anyway, that's one example of it. The other example that came to my mind was Warren Zevon. He had a pretty eclectic career. He was just different. I mean, if you know Warren Zevon, you know what I'm talking about. Most people associate him with Werewolves of London, which is, his most popular song, but definitely not his best work. He found out he had inoperable cancer, terminal cancer, and decided to write one more album. And I believe the title of it was Life Will Kill You. And it was kind of a swan song. It was a man singing about he was resigned to his fate. He knew he was going to die. And he did that last album from that perspective. And it is unbelievable. It's a really powerful album. It'll really make you think. It'll make you feel. It'll, But I can't think of anybody else that really did it the same way that Loudon Wainwright did. So that's that. And then Francis also asked me another musical question. And this one is one of those that I can't come up with an answer to. Favorite beginning and ending to a record. So I'm going to take that as either album or song. And I have a bunch of them. I think one of the most interesting ones I ever found was Pink Floyd's The Wall. There's all kinds of stuff in the background of Pink Floyd music. I mean, all kinds of little things that are inserted in there that if you're not really listening to it, and sometimes even if you don't know it's there by having been told about it or something, you'll never hear it. But if you listen to it, you can hear it. There's a lot of stuff in Led Zeppelin that way. There's a lot of stuff in the Beatles that's that way. But Pink Floyd, the very start of The Wall, if you listen really closely, you can hear somebody say, it sounds like he says, to me anyway, and came in, and came in. If you listen to the very end of that album, you hear the same voice say, somebody spoke. So it's like at some point they recorded this voice saying somebody spoke and came in, and they separated it at the beginning of the album and the end of the album. I always thought that was pretty neat. I wrote down a bunch of them here. A great ending to an album is, there is no dark side in the moon, really. Matter of fact, it's all dark with the heartbeat. One of my favorite beginnings to a song. These are all Pink Floyd. Not all of them, but the few that I'm going to talk about here. One of These Days off of the Metal album. That starts out with some really cool stuff. It's just got this big slow build up to where the song kicks in. It's all these backwards symbols, backmasked symbols, and just some weird stuff in that. I always loved the way that song started. First time I ever heard Dark Side of the Moon, I was listening to it on headphones really loudly. And it got to the third song, and that song is Time. And you know how that song starts out with all those alarm clocks and bells and stuff banging? Scared me to death. Man, I flew up out of bed, threw those headphones off. I'll never forget that one. So, yeah, that was the first time I ever heard that. I was probably 14 or 15 years old, maybe. It had been out for years at that time, but like I said, Led Zeppelin, they've got a ton of stuff in the background of their songs. John Bonham talks a lot at the beginning and ends of their songs. One of them is the ocean. I had to get the groove in my head to remember the name of it. He starts that one out with, we've done 4 already and now we're steady, and then they went boo doo 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 doo. I always liked that. And then there's another song they do, and I can't remember the song. I want to say it's off of Physical Graffiti. And at the end of that one, you hear John Bonham say, "That's the one." The band Yes, Close to the Edge. That album starts out really cool. You hear all these nature sounds and wind chimes and stuff like that, and it builds up into this big kind of cacophony of sound. All the instruments are kind of doing their own thing, and then all of a sudden it melds into that song. They all kind of catch the same groove at the same time. Really enjoyed that one. Iron Maiden has a bunch of songs that have cool stuff at the beginning, like The Number of the Beast, where the dude is quoting and paraphrasing from Revelation. Woe to him. Let him who hath understanding reckon that it is the number of the beast. I'm misquoting that, but you know what I'm saying. Aces High. The start of that with Winston Churchill's speech. We shall defend our island. The Prisoner. You are number 6. I am not a number. I am a free man. Sweet Leaf by Black Sabbath. Starting out with that cough. Could probably be no more either appropriate or inappropriate start to a song. I don't know what. Crazy Train. Ozzy screaming, "All aboard!" And then something about songs with bells that start out. 3 of them came to mind was Hell's Bells by AC/DC, Black Sabbath, the song Black Sabbath, and Metallica's For Whom the Bell Tolls. Yeah, those are cool. And then he asked another very interesting question. Don't think I ever thought about this. The White Album has 30-something songs, 31 songs or something like that on it by the Beatles. In case you didn't know. He said if you could turn that into a single album instead of a double album, what songs would be on it? So it took me a minute. But I think I put together a pretty good version of the White Album. Side 1, and these are in the order that they come on the album, and I've just left some of them out, so I didn't really change the order. Back in the USSR, Dear Prudence, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, I'm So Tired, Blackbird, I Will, and Julia. Side 2, Your Blues, Mother Nature's Son, Sexy Sadie, Helter Skelter, Long, 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 Revolution, and I would end the album, instead of the way they did with Good Night, which is a great end to an album, I would end it with Cry Baby Cry. That just has after, I love the way that my version of side 2 goes. It's like raw Lennon song, Your Blues, and then a very mellow, heartfelt McCartney song in Mother Nature's Son. Back to Lennon with the raw, sexy Sadie, and then a McCartney rocker, Helter Skelter, and then George Harrison's Long, 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 and then Revolution. and then just Cry Baby Cry at the end of that just seems like the perfect ending to me. So anyway, there's my version of the White Album. Some of the songs I left off of that were, I think, them being self-indulgent, filler, weirdness. There's some strange stuff on that album. Alright, so that's that. This is 15 minutes. I'm going to keep going here. Todd Blessing, my good buddy, he said Buzz Aldrin's, let me see, Buzz Aldrin's mother-in-law's maiden name was Moon. Do I know any other weird facts like that? There's a ton of stuff like that, and that made me think of two things. One of them was to keep my pipe going. The other one was to have a drink of water. And that reminds me of two more things. One of them was a theory called nominative determinism. Which basically means people's occupations or their lots in life are in some ways determined by their name. So like, you've heard dentist being named Dr. Payne or Dr. Pullum or Dr. Root, or all kinds of stuff like that. There's look that up. Look up nominative determinism, and you'll find all kinds of just really weird examples. Two guys that had something to do with the development of urology, the urology profession. I can't remember what the first one's name is, but the second one's last name was Whedon, Weedon, so like weed on, urology, weed on. The guy that invented the toilet was named Thomas Crapper. There's debate, but supposedly a guy that had something to do with the design or invention of the brassiere was named Otto Titzlinger. There's tons of stuff like that. It's a pretty interesting concept. And part of that goes back historically. Last names weren't always a thing, apparently. So people who had jobs like, blacksmithing, sometimes their last name would become Smith or Black or something like that. They would say, John the Smith, and then it would turn into John Smith, things like that. A lot of names were developed that way, is my understanding. The other thing it made me think of is coincidence of things happening, like Buzz Aldrin marrying someone named Moon. Coincidences are not as odd as they seem in a lot of ways. You hear stuff like the Lincoln-Kennedy coincidences, all those similarities between President Lincoln and President Kennedy. I can't remember all of them, but like their secretaries' names were reversed or something. One was named Lincoln, one was named Kennedy. The killer of Kennedy was found in a theater, and the killer of Lincoln, I can't remember. Well, he shot him in a theater. There was something about Ford's theater, and I can't, but there's like 30 things. You've seen that list before, right? It'll blow your mind. Some lady did a study and she found, I think it was 27 other combinations of presidents, 27 others that had a very similar list of similarities, a very similar list of similarities. The list was similar to Kennedy's and Lincoln's, and the similarities were to each other. Hey, I made that work. And the theory behind that is there's so much stuff, there's so much data that you can, if you dig deep enough, you can make almost any seemingly random things be very similar. If you dig deep enough, there's a lot of similarities between things because there's so much data to choose from. So things that seem quite odd and coincidental are really just, it's really just math. It's just a matter of numbers. So that's the other thing I thought about when you asked that question. But I always thought Buzz Aldrin had one of the best publicity experiences ever. Some conspiracy theorist confronted him one time, claiming that the moon landing were all staged. And Buzz Aldrin, he was like, I don't know, 65 or 70 or something at the time, reared back, punched him in the face. There, how real is that? He gave him a Jackie Gleason, to the moon, Alice. There's another coincidence for you, right? All right, that's it for this one. I won't bore you guys any longer. Send me more questions, man. Or woman, child. If you're a child, you shouldn't be watching this. You guys have a good day. I mean that sincerely. I'm going to go enjoy my pipe, and I'm going to ignore all the hype. You guys do the same.